German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has spoken by phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin and called for a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible. President Putin is said to have responded by blaming Ukraine for stalling negotiations. But at a meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Germany, Ukraine accused Russia of preferring wars to talks. Attending the summit as a guest, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba called on the gathered representatives of some of the world's largest industrialised economies to step up arms supplies to his country and put more pressure on Russia. This is EU Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell used the meeting to announce another €500 million in military aid to Ukraine. G7 countries have promised to support Ukraine until victory. Let's go through these events with DW political correspondent Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber here in Berlin, and our chief international correspondent Richard Walker is at the G7 meeting in Weissenhaus in northern Germany. Welcome both. Let's start with you, Benjamin. What else did President Putin and Chancellor Scholz discuss today?
It was a long phone call. Germany said that it took 75 minutes, where Chancellor Olaf Scholz urged the Russian president to end the war as soon as possible. Germany said that they addressed specifically the situation in Mariupol, and something that Chancellor Scholz tweeted afterwards. He said that the claim that Nazis rule in Ukraine is false, something that President Putin in Russia is, of course, seeing as a pretext for its invasion in Ukraine.
All right. Richard Walker, a lot of people are going to be looking at this and wondering, well, Chancellor Scholz might as well have saved his breath. Why would President Putin change his mind as a result of a phone call? Is there any significance to this call?
Well, of course, Olaf Scholz has a pretty long history in recent months of trying to communicate with Vladimir Putin. Also, in the weeks leading up to the war, he was one of the leaders who traipsed through Moscow, sat at that very long table in Moscow and tried to communicate with Putin, tried to dissuade him from beginning this war. Obviously, the war has now been underway for a long time. This is the first communication that they've had in several weeks. So it is quite striking that this phone call has taken place now and on such a scale at 75 minutes. I think, one of the things to stress about this kind of phone call is it's partly about Olaf Scholz getting his message across to Vladimir Putin, trying to display the unity that the West has been so keen to show with other partners within the West. But also for the Germans and for other people who've tried to keep up communication with Putin, it's also about the communication the other way. They want to try to understand where he is in his head and at this place in this context, in this conflict, how close he might be to some kind of serious attempt at negotiations. So it's a two-way communication. It's not just about getting messages across to Vladimir Putin. It's also about trying to understand Vladimir Putin, his position at this stage in the conflict, and how close things could be to trying to find a negotiated end to it.
Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, I mean, the first call in 6 weeks between the two leaders. Why pick up the phone now?
If we look at the current context, Ukraine is, of course, the topic of Ukraine. The situation of the war is taking center stage at the G7 foreign ministers meeting here in Germany. The foreign minister, Kuleba, met with German politicians, both from the government and also from the opposition. But Germany is taking a more active role. There has been a lot of pressure, not only from the opposition, but also by government parties for Scholz to be quicker when it comes to deployment of heavy weapons. And Germany is not just will send these heavy weapons, but has also recently started training Ukrainian soldiers here in Germany. So that's, of course, taking a more active role. And what Germany is saying is that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke to the Ukrainian president only a few days ago. So he's trying to maintain the contact. But of course, Scholz and Putin, there was a long silence for several weeks. The last phone call was at the end of March, before we got those terrible pictures out of the city of Bucha, close to the Ukrainian capital. So now he's trying once again to communicate it to both sides.
So, Richard, let's talk about these stalled peace talks, because once again we have each side blaming the other for a lack of progress.
Yeah, that's right, Phil. And Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, is here in northern Germany at this blustery setting for these talks of G7 foreign ministers. He was asked about this just earlier when he came out to give a statement about what is the status of potential negotiations, not just on the overall potential route to an end to this conflict, but also on specific issues such as trying to get Ukrainian grain supplies back onto the seas past a Russian blockade. And he said that in both cases that the Russians were not responding favourably to Ukraine's suggestions for holding talks, and saying that essentially Russia prefers war to talks. Now, of course, both sides will be blaming each other for a lack of progress here. But of course, the benefit of the doubt of the international community is going to be with the Ukrainians. After all, it was the Russians who invaded Ukraine. It's pretty rich, some might say, for the Russians then to invade and then to say to the Ukrainians, why aren't you talking to us?
All right. And now, Chief International Editor Richard Walker, thank you for that. DW political correspondent Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, thank you. Now we'll get an update on the situation on the ground in Ukraine from DW reporter Alex Forrest-Whiting.
Ukrainian forces are continuing their counter-offensive against Russian troops in the northeast of the country, most notably in and around Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city and has been a major Russian target since the start of Moscow's invasion at the end of February. Russian troops have had some success in capturing areas around the city, particularly to the north. But Ukrainian forces are continuing to push them back, and they claim to have recaptured several villages to the northeast of Kharkiv. They're also said to be within just a few kilometres of the Russian border. Ukraine's pushback is also helping to alleviate Russian artillery pressure on the city of Kharkiv, which is protecting civilians from Russian ground force shelling. But there are still Russian rocket strikes on the city, with at least 2 civilians killed on Thursday there. Military experts, though, are beginning to wonder if Ukraine's counter-offensive around Kharkiv is actually looking similar to that around the capital, Kyiv, which Russian troops were driven out of at the end of March. Now, Russia has already taken the city of Izium, but appears to be struggling to advance south from there, and that's partly because Ukrainian forces have been trying to cut off Russian supply lines north of the city. Moscow, though, is still very much focusing its power on the Donbas region, which includes the cities of Luhansk and Donetsk. Now, remember that prior to Moscow's February invasion, Russian-backed separatists held a significant amount of territory there. And Russian forces have been trying to encircle Ukrainian troops in the region, and there has been intense fighting there this week. Now, although Moscow's advance has been slow, even Ukraine has acknowledged that Russia has achieved a partial success there as they have advanced towards cities like Severodonetsk. Now, military experts believe Russia will launch a ground offensive on or around that city in the coming days, although they stress it is not at all certain if Russia will succeed. But Ukrainian forces are still putting up a very strong fight in the region. And British intelligence reported on Friday that Ukraine stopped Russian troops trying to cross a river west of Severodonetsk. And Ukrainian forces are said to have destroyed a bridge there and also parts of a Russian armoured column.
Let's see if we can get an insight into the thinking of the Russian president with Mikhail Kasiniov, who was Russian Prime Minister under President Putin between 2000 and 2004. A former Putin ally, he became a leading political opponent and now lives in exile. He joins us from an undisclosed location in Europe. Welcome to DW. Can we start with where you stand on Russia's war in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's absolutely clear. It's absolutely clear. Just my position was absolutely clear from the beginning. Just invasion to Georgia and annexation of Crimea. That's absolutely clear. I was one of the organizers of those protests and marches in Moscow against against the war in Ukraine. And of course, today's war, this absolutely brutal undertaking by Mr. Putin, and couldn't keep just every normal Russian just indifferent to this. We absolutely condemn this criminal activity of Mr. Putin's regime.
It's interesting, you make the link back to Georgia. You said Georgia through Crimea and, of course, now to Ukraine. Do you see this as being, do you see the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, as being part of a longer-term strategy that Vladimir Putin has been pursuing?
I wouldn't say just long-term strategy of Putin, but it is long-term just patience of the Western world and Germany in particular. And I think just I can remind you that in 2008, after just blockage of the providing so-called just the entry map or just road plan for Ukraine and Georgia to enter NATO, it was Bucharest summit of NATO in April 2014. Right after that, Mr. Putin arranged the provocation in Georgia and invade Georgia. But the Western world reacted very calmly on that. Just 2-3 months after that, just business as usual. That was the relationship, including Germany at that time. And the annexation of Crimea, of course, that was just a major step of Germany. First of all, I remember Angela Merkel at that time, she first was who imposed sanctions against Putin's regime as a result of annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbas. But it was not so harsh. Mr. Putin thought he could overcome, and that's happened now.
And so, just to be clear, you believe that we are here now with Russia invading Ukraine because the West did not act resolutely enough right at the start of this process, perhaps even going back as far as Georgia?
Exactly. That's exactly the case. Mr. Putin, as a result of those reactions, Western reaction, Mr. Putin took this as, I would say, permitted behavior. And that's why he believed that violation of international law, that's allowed him to do this by Western world.
All right. Let's see if we can pick your brain, as it were, given your knowledge of the man. Let's turn to his rare public appearance at the May 9th Victory Day parade. There was no declaration of war and no national mobilisation as had been expected. Why do you think those announcements weren't made?
I didn't expect there would be announcement of war and mobilization because of the simple reason. If Putin would have done this, it would be a demonstration of his weakness, that special operation failed. And just he called for the whole Russian world to help him to get out of this situation. And that's why it couldn't happen. And it didn't. But the reaction of Mr. Putin and his speech was absolutely weak. And his, I would say, behavior was a little bit nervous, and he, I would say, just already started to realize that he's losing this war, especially after all those demonstrations of the European Union, Great Britain, and United States, just of those decisions of delivery of military equipment. That is already just creating some kind of, not yet, but some kind of advantage, decisive advantage of Ukraine in the near future, I believe.
All right, and the fact that Russia is doing so badly in this war, or perhaps not as well as would have been expected, what do you make of the theory that one of the reasons it's prosecuting this war so badly is that President Putin isn't getting a full picture because his generals and his inner circle are scared to give him bad news?
Yeah, I'm sure he was misled. He believed that his army in a great shape, and he would undertake these efforts, this operation, as he called it, within 3-5 days, 1 week maximum, and will get just the maximum he wanted, to regime change. He announced, even you can remember, he called for Ukrainian militaries just to change the regime by their hands, and that was his goal, and occupy just south and eastern Ukraine. But now he failed to achieve this, and that's why just I'm saying right now we're coming to another stage. This competition or rivalry of economic potentials, military potentials. And that's why it's so important that the United States made a decision to provide Lend-Lease program. It means just to create a potential effort of economic potential for Ukraine. And that will be just long-standing war for a few months, I guess, for several months.
If we could just take advantage of your knowledge of the man, having worked closely with Vladimir Putin in the early years of his presidency and indeed before that. How would you say he has changed?
Yeah, I worked with him 20 years ago. It was a completely different person. It was a completely different situation. At that time, we had parliament, independent parliament, we have independent media, we had judiciary. Today is a completely different world. Mr. Putin destroyed all features of democratic state. And now just we have absolutely authoritarian regime and gradually moving to totalitarian one. That's a completely different person, completely different situation right now.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for your insights. Mikhail Kasyniov, former Russian Prime Minister, now political exile and Putin opponent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ukraine and its allies are fighting Russia on another front. Ever since the invasion, there have been widespread fears of cyber attacks. Experts are surprised that Russia hasn't taken down Ukraine's power grid or other critical infrastructure. But Ukrainian hackers have mounted their own successful counter-cyber attacks.
An unlikely soldier. Bogdan Ivashko is a software developer and now part of Ukraine's IT army, striking Russian targets in cyberspace. He helps hack official websites, one of thousands of Ukrainians who aim to show Russians what is really happening in Ukraine, unfiltered by state censorship.
We try to disrupt the propaganda machine and infiltrate different systems of Russian government, Russian structures.
This is a message to Vladimir Putin from Anonymous.
Ukraine's cyber warriors have been joined by the international hacking collective Anonymous. It says it is not against Russia's people or even its soldiers, but against President Putin and his apparatus. And it wants to keep Russia's own cyber experts busy, so they can't attack Ukraine or the West. Russia has a long history of alleged cyber attacks on Ukraine and other countries. It's believed to have hacked into Ukraine's presidential elections and taken out parts of its power grid, as well as trying to destroy internet connectivity. But Russia has always maintained its innocence, claiming that criminal groups, not the government, were responsible. Now, with people like Bogdan and Ukraine's hacker army against it, Russia finds itself on the receiving end of these attacks, with more likely to follow.
Our chief technology correspondent is Janos Stelka. Janos, I remember sitting here on the very first days of the war, reporting on this invasion unfolding, an information war breaking out at the very same time, and also this prospect of a massive cyber event. What happened to that?
It's true, Ben. I mean, in the early days of the war, many experts warned that there would be a massive attack. There could be a massive attack on Ukraine's digital infrastructure that could also have spillover effects all around the world. Now, this kind of cyber apocalypse has not materialized. But what we have seen is something else that's unprecedented, and that's the rise, the emergence of a new form of cyber guerrilla warfare, if you will. We have hacktivists around the world, hackers around the world who have become involved. And what's new is also that the Ukrainian government itself encourages people to do so.
Tell me a bit more about these so-called guerrillas. Who are they and why did they even get involved in this?
Yeah, that's what we wanted to find out. So we tracked down some of them, talked to some of them, and there's no easy answer. So, I mean, they have different motives. They use different cyber weapons. They have different kind of expertise in hacking. But, when it comes to the sort of pro-Ukrainian side, our reporting suggests that there are three groups. There are cybersecurity experts, often in Ukraine. Then there are hacktivists around the world, Anonymous, the collective, maybe most prominently. And then there are volunteers who have little or no experience in hacking. I talked, for example, to a man in Denmark, this IT guy in his mid-40s, who said, he's never even broken the law before this, or done anything with hacking, but now he spends several hours every day attacking Russian websites and trying to bring them down. And these kind of attacks that they're running, they're not sophisticated cyber operations. They're more like online vandalism, but they do have an impact as well.
Tell us more about the other actors involved.
I mean, of course, there are criminals in there, like ransomware groups that usually use hacking to make money. And then, of course, there are state actors. There are intelligence services and their partners. And the truth there is that their work mostly remains in the dark. So, this is just part of their work. It's hacktivists like to talk about what they achieve if they, bring down a site or something. Secret services don't do that because it could compromise their activities. But many experts are convinced that there is quite a bit happening in the dark. So the cyber operations we're seeing might only be the tip of the iceberg.
Just one more thing. We've talked a lot about and compared a lot the Russian forces to the Ukrainian forces. What about in the online war? How well equipped would you say the Ukrainians are?
Well, that's very difficult to say because the Ukrainians has become sort of like the pro-Ukrainian side is spread all around the world now. And there are various different sort of like levels of expertise. What we know is that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian side has support by international tech companies. And they also have the support by other countries. And that, of course, helps them. And, another thing that we have to keep in mind, Ukraine has a lot of experience with thwarting cyber attacks.
Janos Stelke, thank you very much for coming in today. Very exciting, interesting stuff. Thank you.